This conference will now be recorded.
All right, so hello and welcome. My name again is Yeshe Salz. I serve as Project Manager for the Bay Area Climate Adaptation Network. And welcome to our January webinar. We are hosting this through BayCAN's Equity Working Group, which is BayCAN's first work group we just launched last year. And the work group serves to work as both a community of practice for BayCAN members to advance and deepen their equitable adaptation work, as well as an internal brain trust to ensure that BayCAN structures and processes are equitable themselves. So as a part of the work group, we offer a lot of different resources and trainings for our members, and specifically for the work group members. And then this webinar is a part of that. So we'll be hearing from 3 different awesome presenters today that are all BayCAN members doing amazing work across the board in the Bay Area in equitable adaptation initiatives. And so we'll hear some concrete examples, and the point is for this to be an offering for all BayCAN members, and then we're actually going to deepen the conversation at our next equity work group meeting, which will occur on January 20th after the next BayCAN regional meeting. And so if you're interested in joining that meeting and deepening the conversation, you can reach out to me. But for now, we're going to go ahead and get started. Some logistics, just make sure you all are on mute so that we can have really clear audio. And we're gonna hear from these 3 different presenters, and we'll have some time for Q&A after each one. So hold your questions until the end. So with that, I'm going to give it over to our first presenter, Patrick. Let's see.
All right. Hello, everybody.
So I'm gonna introduce you really quick.
Oh, sure.
Patrick grew up in the Bay Area and studied public policy and economics at Pomona College. He served for 1 year as a Civic Spark Fellow at the City of Alameda and has continued as their Climate Action Coordinator since August of 2018. So we're really excited that Patrick is here, and yeah, let's hear what he has to say.
All right. Thanks, Yeshe. And if you can let me know when I have 5 minutes left, that would be great.
Sure.
I'll keep track of time. Hello, everyone. Yeshe just said it. I am going to talk today about a social vulnerability assessment, which I'm going to abbreviate as SVA throughout the whole thing for convenience. And just a note up front, I say presented by me because the bulk of the work on the actual assessment was done by a Climate Corps fellow that we hosted here at the city named Marissa Johnson. And she's the author of this assessment, and it gets the credit for doing it, and wish that she could be here to present, but she's not, so I'm going to do my best. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so that's me. I don't usually dress that fancy, and I was a Civic Spark Fellow from 2017 to 2018. And have been a Climate Action Coordinator since. There's a huge amount of feedback. Okay, it's gone.
Yeah. Let's make sure that everybody's on mute, please. Please mute yourself immediately when you get on the line. Sorry to interrupt, Patrick.
All good. And the other acronym that I will be using a lot in this presentation is CARP, which stands for Climate Action and Resiliency Plan. That's the name of the Climate Action Plan that we just got adopted in September of 2019. And I just wanted to note that I came in right when we were beginning the scoping for that process, and I've been with it and now, and that we're getting into implementation. Next slide, please. Okay, so a brief intro to Alameda. These fuzzy maps over here represent flooding, overtopping from the shoreline at different total water level scenarios. I think that's the top left, 2436, I can't read it actually, and then all the way up to 108. This excludes part of our jurisdiction, which is located on a peninsula to the southeast called Bay Farm Island. This is the main island of Alameda, and as you can see, it gets pretty darn blue once the sea level rise, combined sea level rise and storm surge levels get up there. Alameda itself is an island plus that little peninsula that I mentioned of almost 80,000 people. The whole west end used to be a big military Navy base. Not a whole lot of development, pretty built out, but there is development happening at that Navy base. It's a relatively affluent place, but mixed income, very slight majority renter. Ethnically, it's just under 50% white, maybe 30% or so AAPI, and then smaller Latino and Black populations. And it's mostly a bedroom community, and it's highly climate vulnerable to sea level rise, overtopping, to emergent groundwater, and to earthquakes. Next slide, please. Brief history, very brief. In 2007, community members, my understanding, I wasn't here, my understanding is that community members initiated a climate action thrust, and that culminated in 2008 when our first climate action plan was passed. That was led by the planning department and also resulted in a local community group called Community Action for Sustainable Alameda being formed. In 2013, there was a 5-year update, which was led by our municipal utility, Alameda Municipal Power. In 2017, community comes back to council, asks for an update to the climate action plan. In 2018, and that's right about when I came in. In 2018, the update begins, led by yet another department. This time it's Public Works, and expands to include adaptation. Last year in March, a climate emergency declaration was passed, put forward by this same community group. And in September 2019, the plan is adopted and implementation begins, and now it's led by the city manager's office. So it's bounced around a bunch. Next slide, please. Adaptation planning was not part of the first plan, so it didn't really become part of our climate work until 2018. We followed the ART planning process, which you see a diagram here of on the right. Our biggest vulnerability is sea level rise and concomitant groundwater rise, and we didn't plan for end of century scenarios. We just looked at a 36-inch total water level threshold for now, because that gave us plenty to work with, and we're addressing those initial flooding vulnerabilities, and we'll look forward to the more drastic projections as we continue in our iterative planning process. I mentioned the vulnerability of groundwater. We're wrapping up an initial study on that, on vulnerabilities and potential steps forward right now. And our social vulnerability assessment is part of our adaptation planning process, and that's what I'm going to get in for the rest of the time. Next slide. The social vulnerability assessment is a spatial analysis of socioeconomic indicators, census indicators that affect an individual or household or community's ability to prepare for, respond to, or recover from a hazard event like flooding, hazardous air quality, extreme heat, etc. The data is coming at the census block group level. There are 57 census block groups in Alameda, and the data was curated by ABAG MTC, I think as part of their Stronger Housing, Safer Communities planning work, and that's where we got a hold of it. And basically the way that it works is that if in like a 0 or a 1, the indicator is a 0 if the concentration of a particular thing, like proportion of renters in a block group, is below the 70th percentile as compared to all block groups in the Bay Area, and it's a 1 if it's above that 70th percentile. And then this color map shows the concentration, how many indicators are above that 70th percentile for a given block group across these 10 indicators. And we could talk more about that if people are curious. Next slide, please.
Patrick, I just want to let you know you've got 5 minutes.
Okay, great. I'll speed up. Where did it come from? I pretty much mentioned that already, but just to let you know that I looked at other social vulnerability methodologies when considering how to set up this one. Next slide. So how did it happen? Just about 2 years ago on New Year's, I committed to integrating social equity into our adaptation planning process. It wasn't a part of that at the time. And then spent the next, actually more like 6 months doing scoping and setup work coming across this as an idea that I thought could help get more of that human-centered lens into our adaptation planning work. And the way that it worked out was I asked for and was able to get a fellow to work with through the Climate Corps program, and that was Marissa. And then Marissa basically ran with it and did the whole thing for about 9 months with me supporting. And then since June, what I've been doing with it has been trying to integrate the social vulnerability assessment into other departmental work and into our implementation process. Next slide. The results, I can show you more, but basically layering, we have a map that layers these different indicators on top of each other, looks at concentrations of indicators throughout our jurisdiction. Next slide. How is it being used? Not much, not enough. I would say application is a challenge that I'm working with right now, but it's in the environmental annex, which is a what to do in case of hazardous scenarios, an annex to an emergency operations plan. It's also going to be used in our active transportation plan, which is just starting right now, and I'm really excited about that, hoping that it can be quite integrated. Next slide. Successes, lessons learned. For me, it was really helpful to have a fellow or intern. I've also worked with them to help kind of grow this work that's outside of the mainstream within our organization, and just have more capacity. I also found it helpful to get in equity language in our climate action plan before there was any substance to it, because then, a year plus later, then we can be like, well, we said this thing, but we aren't doing anything about it. Kind of building the case for more substantive work later on. Working interdepartmentally is key because those are the implementers, and then being patient and persistent. Next slide. This is kind of like a wish list. I would say the one that I actually had capacity for that I didn't do is just asking myself and others over and over, how will this be used? How will it actually change outcomes? And just having that be a driving question for how we do the work from the very beginning and throughout to make sure that it's actually used. Next slide. Where to go from here? Lots of things. For me, the number one thing is developing an equity lens and framework that uses this, which is not explicitly equity related, right? It just has overlap, and other resources to really shape what kind of projects we're doing, how we are doing them, how we're partnering with community, when do they happen in terms of priority, and who's bearing the costs and benefits, especially looking at funding, because a lot of our revenue raising options are regressive. Yeah, and then there's other stuff on the slide. Next slide, I think I'm done. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Patrick. We have around 7 minutes for Q&A, so we can really have some discussion here. If folks have thoughts, questions, we can just really explore these ideas. So if you also want to extrapolate any more, Patrick, there's time for that as well. And if people need to use the chat resource to ask their questions, that's available, but it'd be great to hear people's voices. So just unmute yourself if you have any questions.
Hello, this is Nathan Bengtson from PG&E. Thank you for presenting, Patrick. We've come across each other in a couple different places, so it's cool to see you still on this work. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the resources you use to build your own vulnerability index. And I know that one of the major exposures for Alameda is sea level rise, but did you consider whether the 10 demographic factors you chose were appropriate for sort of all climate threats, or if you were really sort of gearing them towards the sea level rise threat?
Yeah, it's a great question. We used the 10 indicators that were pre-selected by MTC ABAG, and I believe that they are the same indicators that they use to identify communities of concern through their Plan Bay Area process. So that's where that came from, rather than creating our own methodology. We piggybacked on what the regional agencies were doing, and I'm still working to understand the applicability in terms of shoreline flooding, because we know the low spots on our shoreline, and it's not immediately apparent how the inland distribution of these vulnerability indicators will inform how we prioritize the like shoreline protection.
Mm-hmm.
So the answer is no, we haven't adapted it to specific hazards.
Thank you.
We have other questions on the line. We have some in the chat function, but I want to leave space for people to speak if they have more questions.
Oh, well, I'm looking at the questions. Can I?
Yeah. Well, why don't I read one out loud so that
Sure.
so that you can answer it. I want to read out Alex Morrison's question. Where were you able to engage decision makers in the process to try to get buy-in higher up in the organizational hierarchy?
Yeah, also a good question. I would say that I engaged the decision makers in our climate action planning process to the degree that I got a blessing to, yes, go ahead and do this. You can put out a scope of work for this fellow that includes this project, and you can have space in the, I kind of carved out a little section in the climate action plan and like held it until we had this work available, and then was able to put it in there. But it emerged in a kind of siloed, separate process. It wasn't there from the very beginning. And I think because it wasn't there from the very beginning, it is not well integrated into the inertia of how we're doing our adaptation planning right now. So the answer is yes, a little bit more would have been helpful.
So we have another question here from Christina Hill. Hi, Christina. Good to see your question. She's asking, has Alameda used the social vulnerability assessment to do an equity audit to find out if their public works investments are serving vulnerable communities at the same or higher level than less vulnerable residents?
No, but I would love to do that, and I'm hopeful that in 2020 we can get more systematic about our approach to equity work and build on this tool to ask those kinds of questions and get it more built into how we do lots of different operational things. It's a great idea.
Great. Then we have another question from Susan Silber. She's asking, what would be your vision for actually applying this if that is a challenge, and what would be your ideal next steps?
Can you go back to the slide where I say what I want my next steps to be? Yeah, I would say that one ideal next step would be that would be the next slide, Yeshe.
Great.
Applying this to the active transportation plan, which is a plan that's happening right now. We're just getting started. They are aware of the social vulnerability assessment. They're trying to use it. I'm talking with them later today about equity, the approach to equity in that planning process. And so my ideal next step would be, let's do that as well as we can. And in order to, troubleshoot and do the best that we can to make it a case study internally for how we can do the rest of our planning processes with equity more and more central.
Great. Okay, we have another question here. Was there any outreach to the team parts of the community identified as vulnerable?
A tiny bit. It was this is a very unideal planning process and piece of equity-based work. I got a little bit out to some more city-affiliated groups like Commission on Disability and did some outreach there. Homelessness committee, homeless outreach team partnership with some local nonprofits. But it was hard to get traction. It just needed way more time than I had as a part-time person with a lot of other things on the docket. Unfortunately, it was very imperfect, but wanted to do something.
Okay, we have time for, actually, that's it. That's time. Perfect. Thank you all so much for asking these great questions. And Patrick, really want to thank you for taking this time and sharing the work you all have done, such important work. So thanks again for that presentation. And now it's time to move on to our next presenter. We now have Hannah Duress coming to us from the County of San Mateo. Hannah is a climate specialist at the County of San Mateo's Office of Sustainability. She previously served on the steering committee of Resilient Communities Initiative and co-founded Sea Level Rise Equity Coalition, Shore Up Marin, and the Bay Area Hub of American Society of Adaptation Professionals. So we're so excited that Hannah's here with us today, and yeah, let's hear from her.
Thank you for the opportunity. Very excited to be here. So I am working on my PowerPoint, Yeshe, so I will just prompt you for the slides. So if you can go to slide 2. So what I wanted to do today is share with you about the process that we use to have pilot projects here in San Mateo County. I think the process is interesting and might be applicable in other communities. So my main focus today is really kind of our thought process of how we put this project together. And then I will reference the pilots in addition, but more in a summary fashion. And then if people are really interested in the pilots, I recommend inviting the pilot leads to come and present at a future event. So just to give some background, here at County of San Mateo and the Office of Sustainability, we've been really excited to have a Climate Ready SMC collaborative. I know many of you on the phone have come to some of our convenings or have been following this, and we really appreciate that. But basically what we're trying to do with the overall project is to really understand what are we looking at in terms of 4 main climate impacts, and those are extreme heat, extreme storms, sea level rise, and wildfire. And also to bring together cross-sector and community-based leaders to together learn and identify gaps and opportunities in addressing those issues. So that's kind of the big picture. The funders for the project are Caltrans and the county. And within that effort, which has had many convenings and task forces and other aspects, we had the opportunity to fund 2 pilots, $60,000 each, and to provide in-kind support from consultants. So we were working with Ecology and Environment and Urban Permaculture Institute as the consultants there. The timeline was from summer to January, and we had a great opportunity to work with a group of community-based organization leaders that were kind enough to meet with us and give input on the guidelines before we got to the point where we needed to, for those that wanted to apply, we needed to move, allow those folks to move on so that they would be able to apply when we actually started to have the RFP open. So, and then we started working with equity experts who had been really involved with the Climate Ready effort, including Greenlining and Urban Permaculture Institute, as well as our internal staff to do the application review. Just want to see if there's a couple other things that I would like to highlight there. One thing that we did is we really tried to think through ways to eliminate barriers for example, for unincorporated areas, for the guidelines to work as well for them as they did for a city, and also to think through what it would be like for a nonprofit or a community-based organization to apply and how the application process might work for them. So we did a few things to try to address that in terms of offering some varied requirements to address those situations. So next slide, please. So basically, the goals of this project were to plan for climate change impacts, to develop place-based adaptation plans, and to really promote inclusive community-based planning, and to build capacity of socially vulnerable communities. And then another piece was to really try to build relationships and collaboration between community-based organizations or nonprofits and government. Next slide, please. And we were really also trying to sort of focus on the planning at a city or neighborhood scale. So just to highlight in terms of this group being focused on equity, I wanted to highlight that we really were very thoughtful about equity aspects in the evaluation criteria. So there was a focus on socially vulnerable communities, another focus area on inclusiveness of operations and methods of the project, and other equity approaches, including participatory planning and other kinds of enhanced community priority setting and things of that nature. So overall, and also I provided a link to the full guidelines so that you can look through those, and happy to answer any questions about that. There's also an FAQ on the site as well. But basically that accounted for about 45% of the points. So it really helped to elevate proposals that were very more seriously trying to address these kinds of issues. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of ground this a little bit in kind of a planning framework. So many of us are familiar with USDN's framework that is kind of what they see as an optimal framework for trying to incorporate a more equitable process in planning. And the thing that I thought was really interesting about this is that when we were going into this project, of course, we really wanted to support more inclusive planning. And so we thought that the proposals that we would get would really put us kind of smack dab in the middle of planning or possibly even project concept and implementation. You can see from the red line, what I'm showing is kind of where we thought the proposals would be, and the star is where actually the proposals really were more focused, which is community and local government readiness. So I definitely recommend people check out the USDN Equitable Community-Driven Climate Preparedness Planning Framework if you haven't already. And it was just really interesting to reflect that in order to support really inclusive or more equitable planning processes, we really have to start at the beginning and help community and government get more ready and also build their relationships and their effectiveness at communicating together. So let's see. And then I think it also takes time to sort of reflect on where are the different entities. Sometimes government and community may not be in exactly the same place, and it's important to leave time to kind of talk things through and arrive at a effective plan together. So I want to share with you just a couple highlights from the pilot projects themselves. Next slide, please. So
and I want to let you know you've got about 4 minutes.
Okay, I will try to speed it up. So the City of Half Moon Bay was one of the 2 pilot sites, and this is a really exciting effort because it was a precursor effort to support their climate action and adaptation plan. And this effort, which is a collaboration with 3 community-based organizations, including ALAS, Ayudando Latinos a Soñar, Senior Coastsiders, and Youth Leadership Institute, really worked on building the capacity of community members in those target populations, Latinos, seniors, and youth, and also collected priorities and concerns from those community members to inform the planning process. And this is all taking place right before Half Moon Bay is creating their RFP, and so it's going to form and flow into that process. So, and then this is part of their larger goal to have robust education and outreach for the entire community. So, and then that had support from 2 consultants, and especially ecology and environment responded to the need of the community organizations to really have a lot of technical information and information about climate action planning and specific. So next slide, please. This is just a photograph here from Ayudando Latinos a Soñar of a mural that was created through a community process where a number of community members gave input about their thoughts about the past, present, and future relative to climate risks. It was a really interesting conversation. This all took place in Spanish, and that was one of many efforts to bring out the community's concerns and priorities and kind of engage the community in a more robust way. So, and that was in addition to focus groups, movie screenings, and a variety of other efforts that you see there. Next slide, please.
Thanks so much.
So then we were also really excited about an effort that Actera proposed that took place in East Palo Alto, and they formed with a number of community leaders as well as partner organizations a community climate change team. And this is really exciting. So some of the partners were Youth United for Community Action, the Anamantangi Polynesian Voices, and Nuestra Casa. And Urban Permaculture Institute was a major part of this project through capacity building and training efforts and collaborating with the community. The goals were to develop a community-based agenda for climate change. So it's been really exciting to see that developing, as well as an assessment of vulnerabilities and adaptation strategies. And for both of these projects, we're waiting for the final reports, so we don't have all the final information yet. And it'd be really exciting to, for those pilots to share their findings when they're complete. One of the key priorities for this community group is to influence the city of East Palo Alto to prioritize climate. It's not currently a top priority, and they're really wanting to build the capacity of community leaders, which they already have done a great job of doing so, to engage in climate planning. So, and one of the key approaches here is to start from community assets, knowledge and priorities. And a main focus on this effort has been kind of a train the trainer approach. Next slide. This is a photograph of a really exciting event. And this was a real opportunity for us to really be responsive to the community. And once the community took leadership through this community climate change team, then started setting the agenda. Of course, it diverged from the exact plan of the grant, and so it was an opportunity to hear what the needs were as identified by the leaders, and then see what we could do to be responsive to them. So Actera came back to us with a proposal to shift funding to respond to community desire to do an implementation rather than just having more of an intellectual and more planning process. So there seems that reflects, I think, a lot of frustration on the part of communities of kind of a lot of planning processes, and they're constantly being asked for input, but not seeing outcomes. So we were able to work together and shift the funding so that this rain garden and water catchment system was installed at the Youth United for Community Action site. And the rainwater capture system is not in the picture, but it holds over 1,000 gallons of rainwater. And this is an exciting opportunity. You can see the youth in the picture. We're all getting dirty, shoveling shovels, and having a great time. And you can see Pandora Thomas and Kevin Bayek from Urban Permaculture, who are doing training around the rain garden in the picture. So it was really exciting, and the community team also identified the need for a survey that was not in the scope, and Actera was able to find additional funding for that. But I think a key lesson learned. Why don't we go to the next slide, Yeshe? And that was, of course, a multilingual survey to work with all of the different populations they were trying to engage with: Pacific Islander communities, Latino community, and youth and African Americans. So,
Hannah, just so you know, we've got to wrap up pretty soon here to have time for the next presenter.
No problem. So, I included some lessons learned, and I'm happy to answer questions and things like that. But I think that our timeline was really compressed. There really is a need for sustained capacity building and sustained capacity for community organizations to engage over the long term, for them to be able to have staff that can develop expertise over time on these issues. I think that's a key issue in our ability to collaborate and support efforts in the community. And also the needs from the community go beyond particular scopes and planning processes. So being able to be responsive and helpful and responsive to those things is important. Next slide. So, this kind of gives you a sense of some of the thoughts that we had. But really, there's just it's very important to have iterative efforts where things can respond to community leadership, and also ongoing support to try to basically help respond to needs that arise, that I think is really typical of community-led projects.
Wonderful.
And that's it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. So much important information here. We've got about 2 minutes for Q&A. We probably have time for like 2 questions, and then we'll move on to our next presenter. So I'm seeing one question here right now in the chat function. The question is, so the community and youth decided that they wanted this rain garden project?
The community asked for it. So, but Actera was the grantee, so we had to work with Actera to amend the scope. Community asked for it, and Actera is part of that conversation because they are coordinating the community climate change team. And then they brought it back to us to work on adjusting the grant so that could be possible.
Great. So are there any other questions on the line? Folks want to speak up? We probably have time for maybe 2 more, actually. Anybody want to get off mute? Anybody? Well, maybe not. All right, that's all right. So we can leave time at the very, very end after our final presenter if there's any last questions that folks have, or they can use the chat function to ask Hannah directly. Any remaining questions? which gets us right back on schedule. Perfect. Thank you all. Thanks again so much, Hannah, for your time. And now let's move on to our next presenter. We've got now here with us Shayna Hirschfield-Gold from the City of Oakland, who serves as the project manager for the city's new 2030 Equitable Climate Action Plan and has been with the City of Oakland Sustainability Program since 2014. She is responsible for overseeing progress, developing policy, and implementing programs in support of Oakland's Energy and Climate Action Plan, as well as acting as a liaison with the city's environmental and climate justice community organizations. So with that, hand it over to Shayna. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through these first few slides. Basically, I'm going to give an overview of how the City of Oakland is approaching our climate action work and task for the next 10 years, which just to kind of give you the part of the conclusion, there is a very strong process question, and then there is a very strong kind of outcome or action story. So we're going to talk about both of those. You can go on to the next slide. So in 2018, the Oakland City Council, oh wow, these slides look kind of funky on here. I apologize, there might be some formatting issues as we go. Our City Council adopted a climate emergency and just transition resolution at the end of 2018. At that point, staff began in earnest working on our next 10-year climate action plan. We're currently still in the implementation period of our city's first climate action plan, which was called an ECAP before, used to stand for Energy and Climate Action Plan. And so our first one was designed to get us to 2020, a 36% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by that year. This next plan that we're working on now is to get us to our 2030 target adopted by Council of 56% reduction. You can move on to the next slide. So the way that we, gosh, this formatting is funky. The way that we're structuring our work now is kind of really in this rubric of CAP 2.0. We're starting, some folks are starting to say, well, this is really sort of a CAP 3.0 because of all of the stuff that we are trying to include in it. So one of the things that kind of sets this apart from how we did things before is this centering of equity throughout the plan. So we kind of repurposed the acronym. It's still an ECAP, but it stands for Equitable Climate Action Plan. And the way that we're approaching this in some ways stems from the work of our Department of Race and Equity, which published an Equity Indicators report in 2018 and has really been pushing departments across the city to do work focused on hard data on racial disparities throughout the city. And of course, racial disparities permeate everything, including climate equity, environmental justice, all the stuff that the presenters have been speaking about so far, you know, how folks are ready to respond to the impacts of climate change, able to kind of get in on the opportunities of mitigating climate change at the local level, all of that. So really leading with equity. And then within that, the plan is looking at both how do we stop climate change and how do we adapt to climate change. And within that former category, we're definitely including both mitigation and sequestration. So all the different things that you see there, which is no great shakes to the folks on this phone, I think, so I'm not going to go through this chart. So we can go on to the next slide. The work that we're doing on the adaptation side is really rooted in data. In 2016, starting in 2016, we worked with Bloomberg Associates and others to develop this CURB report, which probably a lot of people on the phone are aware of. The CURB report used this tool that was developed by Bloomberg Philanthropies and the World Bank, designed to do kind of almost a deep scenario analysis for climate change mitigation, looking at cost-effective scenarios. So we did deep dives in the building sector and in the transportation sector, published this in 2018, and the 5 strategies that you see listed there on the left of the screen are really the 5 strategies in obviously the 2 sectors most responsible for our local emissions that we have to accomplish if we are to achieve our 2030 and 2050 GHG emission reduction targets. So again, we do this work rooted in data and science, but what these 5 strategies don't tell us is the how. Obviously, these also don't get into the other sectors of, waste and consumption, carbon sequestration. Certainly, this doesn't get into adaptation. So all of that we have, had to work in our analysis. But in terms of the major strategies, the sort of traditional emphasis of a climate action plan, looking at how to stop climate change, this is what we need to do, but we need to know how to do it. And that's where this big process of community engagement and all the rest comes in. So let's move on to the next slide. In this process of developing our 2030 ECAP, we have sort of 5 pillars that we're building everything on, and in their most pithy presentation, this is how we think of them. So first and foremost, the plan has to be realistic. We've got to look at, is this realistic for staff time, for funding, for legal authority, our sphere of control, things like that. We have a climate emergency and just transition declaration. It's got to be ambitious in responding to the emergency, acting like it is an emergency. So, that's really kind of the starting point. And then it's got to be based in equity, like I was saying before. So we've got to prioritize actions that are going to maximize benefits to frontline communities and minimize harms or burdens to frontline communities. So, it's all the things that we know about making sure that our homes and places of cultural refuge are resilient to all the changes that are happening. It's green jobs, it's clean air, it's looking at ground contamination, all of that. And then balanced, again, like I said, mitigation and adaptation, looking at things that we can do right away as well as things that are more moonshot. And probably a lot of you know that the City of Oakland does both local or core greenhouse gas emissions inventories as well as consumption or life cycle and emissions inventories going back to 2005. So we're building all of that into our plan. So you can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm speeding through all this because I know that the focus here is how we are incorporating equity into this plan. And so this is really where we start to get into it, is noting that so much of this work is profoundly interdisciplinary, is profoundly intersectional. So the topics that you see listed there on the left are really the topics that we see intersecting across all of the major topics in the climate action plan. So our draft ECAP is split into the actions are really listed along sort of a little bit more traditional sectors. So transportation and land use, buildings and energy, material consumption and waste, carbon removal, that's our sort of attempted and accessible term for carbon sequestration. And then, adaptation and city leadership and the Port of Oakland. But cross-cutting over all of those are these major topics. And so we try to deal with these, interwoven within each of those sectors. And then in the plan, if you look at the draft, or you'll look at the final, because some of these aren't as explicit in the draft that we published in October. But we will have specific sections talking about each of these and really getting into how, for example, housing security, why is that an issue for climate? Why is that a major equity issue in Oakland, such a diverse and profoundly inequitable city? Why is this so central to the climate crisis, and why does it have to be so central to our response? And then how is that reflected in the actions that we're developing throughout the plan? And so we're doing that with each of these sectors. But how are we doing that? We can move on to the next slide. The way that we are starting, the way that we started to integrate those into the plan, this is a slide I knew that the words were not going to show up very well. We started really with process equity. So I'm going to slow down a little bit now because I wanted you to get that kind of big picture of how we're looking at the plan. And now I'm going to slow down to get a little bit more into how are we operationalizing this. So we started doing this work, like I said, in mid to early 2018 in earnest, before Council passed the Climate Emergency and Just Transition Resolution. And the framework that we developed for creating the plan was sort of this two-part approach, where we actually have two separate consultant teams. One of them is our sort of more traditional CAP development consultant that any city who has done a climate action plan, almost any city, unless you've done it in-house, you probably have hired sort of a traditional CAP development consultant. So we have that. But we also have a separate consultant team that we are calling an equity facilitator. And that team is really charged with creating and implementing this community engagement process that is across Oakland, but with a particular emphasis on what we are calling frontline communities. And maybe I should get a little bit more into what frontline communities are. Some folks are saying, oh yeah, absolutely, that is the term that people are using these days. You have to use that term. And then other people say, I've never heard of a frontline communities. What are you talking about? It sounds like code. So the way that the City of Oakland defines frontline communities is those communities that have been and will continue to be hit first and worst by the impacts of climate crisis and environmental injustice, and the communities that are the least able to adapt, resist, and recover from those impacts. So these are communities that are largely people of color, largely low income, often English language learning. They tend to live, these are the communities that are often around areas with the worst air and soil pollution, traffic congestion. So, you know, the parts of the city that have really been beset by kind of these market failures, you might think of it, right? So industrial pollution, environmental injustice, congestion, diesel particulate exposure, least access to nature, concrete jungles. So we kind of wrap all of that into our definition of frontline communities. And then, of course, if you're talking about specific sectors within the plan or specific actions, the definition might change a little bit. So certain areas are more impacted by diesel particulate matter or lack of access to nature or urban heat islands. So we kind of try to tease that out for, you know, differential emphasis of resources depending on the part of the plan that we're talking about. So I just wanted to take a moment to focus on that definition of frontline communities. But now I'm going to go back a little bit.
I just wanted to let you know, sorry to interrupt, that if we want to have any time for questions, maybe around like 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, that's fine.
Just so you're aware.
That's fine. Sure. So going back to kind of this process that's led by our equity facilitator, all of what's listed there on the left hand are the ways that we are attempting to engage the community. So we had workshops in each of our council districts. We've had climate equity work days where people could really get their hands dirty and engage in the work that we're talking about. Stakeholder meetings across you know, everybody, pop-up engagement. We had a survey online that more than 800 people responded to when we published the draft plan in October, we held 2 community-wide town halls. And like I said, we published that draft online using a portal that everyone, that people could sign up and respond to and actually comment on, give thumbs up or thumbs down to other people's comments. We have an online portal where people can learn more. You can move on. So, you know, huge, diverse process in trying to engage as many folks as possible. And then the next thing, which I've been kind of talking about all along the way, is how are we actually embedding what we're learning from the community into the plan and making sure that all those voices that we're hearing and all of that, you know, local insight and wisdom from particularly the communities that are most impacted are getting into the plan. And so that's where we're kind of marrying that with data. And doing this iterative drafting where our equity facilitator is kind of taking what is being heard in the community and sort of distilling it and saying, well, this is what we're hearing. You've got to, you know, do more work to reflect this in the plan, or, you know, maybe that's what was said, but you know, that's maybe what was said explicitly, but here's a better way to actually get at the intent of those voices. So there is a little bit of that interpretation that our equity facilitator is working on. Right now, our equity facilitator is actually doing a racial equity impact analysis of the draft, along with the same time that we're doing kind of a financial analysis of the draft. So all of this is kind of, it's concurrent, it's working together, and you can move on. I don't think we have time to go through this next slide in detail. I can send this out, but this is something that our equity facilitator prepared, and this is one way that that we are kind of analyzing draft actions in the plan to make sure that they are actions that are likely to reduce disparities across the city. So I think I'll skip there's one more slide that kind of goes through final steps, which you can't read anyway. So we'll kind of skip this. We're planning on bringing the plan to council in June, which is the main thing that was saying. So in the interest of leaving time for questions, I will stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shayna. Really amazing work at Oakland, and feels really important to get some of those specifics and that information in for all the rest of us in the Bay. So let's hear some questions. What do folks want to ask with the few minutes we have left?
I have a question. This is Susan Silber. There are so many community-based organizations doing this kind of work in Oakland, yet they're extremely under-resourced, underfunded. Is there a way to really build robust partnerships with these community-based organizations that kind of redistribute some of these resources to them so that they could do the work intended from this?
Absolutely, that's a great question, and that is kind of the next step that we're starting to look at. I'm working with our Department of Race and Equity as well as with some community organizations to start to say, okay, how can we build capacity in the city of Oakland? Because that is a major challenge, and it's actually been sort of a process challenge for us as we went along. Our equity facilitator team is actually made up of some of those same local community groups, and they're under-resourcing, even though we've been paying them as a consultant, has actually been a direct challenge in this process, because just they lack a lot of the capacity that other more traditional consultants might have. And so that's definitely something that we're working through and working with community groups to figure out how can the city kind of do better on our end, and how can we help community groups better just be better prepared for the type of capacity and project management ability that is needed when working with the city on something like this.
Following up on that question, I want to bring in this question here. Who were your consultants for the equity facilitation work, and how did you fund the process of putting together the ECAP? Was it through general funding or grants?
Through the general fund. We carved out money a few years ago, asked council for money a few years ago for this. It was not enough, I will tell you that. Our equity facilitator is it's a team led by Environmental Justice Solutions and the Oakland Climate Action Coalition.
Great. One more question here, or we've got two more for folks that want to stay on the line. One is, how is the equity impact assessment being done, and how will it be used?
I'm not sure what is meant by the equity impact assessment. I'm guessing that might be the racial equity impact analysis. So that is being led by Environmental Justice Solutions, using a combination of tools that they developed and that our Department of Race and Equity developed. And it's basically a process of going through each individual action item. And if you can actually go back 2 slides, it kind of goes through this methodical, this one, sort of this methodical approach to each action item, and asks kind of a series of questions of what are the likely impacts, who is involved, who has to be involved in implementing, who is involved in creating the action, and sort of goes action by action to identify what are the likely impacts. So that's how it's being used. And then how is it? What was the second part of that?
How is it being used?
It's being used to kind of improve, I guess, each action item in the plan, and then kind of looking at the plan as a whole to make sure that each action and the plan as a whole will be likely to reduce disparities across the city.
So I'm gonna bring in one more question, then we're gonna wrap up. This question is, I'm wondering what approaches for intentional outreach were used by the consultants to make sure those frontline communities made it into the room.
What approaches were used? Yeah, the equity, so a few things. The equity facilitator put together what they called a neighborhood leadership cohort when they were first hired, and that cohort is made up of at least 2 residents from each council district, specifically from frontline communities. And their recruitment for that was focused on not hiring people who were, already working at CBOs or nonprofits, but, just regular community members. And they went through this whole training process with them on what is the climate crisis, how does government work, what is this specific process all about. And so really empowered the members of that neighborhood leadership cohort to go out and be engaging their neighbors and friends and family members. And then second of all, it's just been within the capacity of the equity facilitator team to go out and leverage their networks to get people out to the meetings. So they have been solely charged with that work, and so they're leveraging their networks primarily through the Oakland Climate Action Coalition to get frontline community members out to the workshops and the town halls and such.
Okay, so we've still got more questions. I'd encourage the people that didn't get to ask them to reach directly out to Shayna because we are at time. I wanted to thank our presenters first and foremost for presenting such amazing work happening across the Bay. Thank you all so much for taking this time to share with us. And yeah, let this be a way to continue to scale up the work across the Bay Area. And we hope that you can join us if you want to deepen the conversation at the next Equity Workgroup meeting that will be held on February 20th after the BayCAN Regional. And we'll continue this conversation of what it means to operationalize equity into the many phases of the adaptation planning process. So that's all for today. We really, again, want to thank our presenters and you all for attending. And again, reach out to me, and my email is posted on the BayCAN website if you're interested in coming to the work group meeting, and reach out to the presenters if you have more questions. Thanks everybody so much for your time.
Thanks, Yeshe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.